Hi, Brian. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
As you know, we're producing a video series on innovation at the local level for addressing environmental community problems. One of the most effective ways to do that, as many of us know, is to better engage the community itself. And Washington, D.C. took a very innovative approach in how it implemented its stormwater program by using markets and better gauging businesses and enterprise in the system. Presumably, that's still an important part of what you do and what the program is doing. If so, we're hoping you could explain that a little bit more, and if not, how you see things changing and what you see in the future.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an important piece of it is taking advantage of some of those market efficiencies, reducing costs, innovation. But it's also, for us, the credit trading program that we have it's about leveraging private capital. You know, we know that we have billions of dollars of work that we need to do to install runoff reducing green infrastructure, to retrofit the municipal separate storm sewer system, part of DC, which is about 2/3 of the city. And we have about $10 million a year to spend on that work. So $10 million a year, billions of dollars of cost. We can't do it on our own.
Right.
We really needed the development community, who is rebuilding the city at a really rapid pace, to be part of the solution to the problem. So we needed to have stormwater management regulations in place that would require runoff reducing green infrastructure to be installed by these projects. And so we were looking at putting in place, partially driven by the MS4 permit issued to us by EPA Region 3, but looking at putting in place really strong regulations, some of the strongest regulations in the country to require green infrastructure. And we heard loud and clear from the development community that there needed to be some flexibility. There needed to be some options for sites that had either technical, environmental or financial constraints on them. And what we ended up doing was looking at, all of the vast areas of imperviousness that there are in the city, the parking lots and the rooftops. And even though development operates at a pretty big scale in the city, there's still the overwhelming majority of the city isn't going through development at any given point in time. And all of those areas with impervious surface represent an opportunity for installation of a runoff reducing green infrastructure practice like bioretention or rain gardens that can earn credits that could be sold to a regulated site that needs some flexibility in terms of where it's achieving it.
So what many people have observed is that engaging new development is the most logical way to move the system forward, and that's certainly the way things have been in Washington, D.C. But it sounds like what you're saying now is that you have figured out a system for engaging existing development. Is that what I'm hearing?
In an ultra-urban city like Washington, D.C., development that triggers our stormwater management regulations is almost always redevelopment of existing built environment. It's not greenfields development. Right. And so when a development project triggers our regulations on a parcel that previously had no green infrastructure installed on it, they trigger our regulations, they install green infrastructure at the end of their project. It's a dramatic improvement over the status quo before a project. It's very different from a development project that's plowing under a farmer's field or a meadow or forested area.
Right.
It's a very different context. So for us, development is really our ally for getting green infrastructure installed. And we realized that we could allow some flexibility by allowing this stormwater credit trading option to regulated sites. And we also realized that there was the potential to get better outcomes in that kind of an approach than we would in a stricter, more traditional on-site regulatory approach.
So I think I've heard you say before that you're now getting more land area treated with more best management practices, which means you are collecting and treating more rainfall. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. You're catching more rain and also shifting more of the green infrastructure to the places that need it most. We most need that green infrastructure to be installed in the MS4 part of the city, the part of the sort of the peripheral 2/3 of the city, the downtown core of the city, which is combined sewer and which is mostly going to be going into large underground tunnels that are being installed to manage that overflow volume. While green infrastructure is beneficial there, the water quality benefit is relatively minor, and shifting that green infrastructure out to the MS4 is a dramatic improvement in terms of protection for our water bodies, because in the MS4 most of those areas are draining without treatment into the water body, so that's a big benefit. So credit trading is a way for us to leverage private capital and making regulations possible that require development to really become the linchpin or the driving force behind retrofitting DC's impervious surface with green
So,
infrastructure.
so expand on that for a second. Did you see this as being a mechanism that you were actually able to bring the developers around and get something done?
And the environmental stakeholders, not just
That's
EPA,
true,
but also
yeah,
the environmental
right.
stakeholders
Right.
as an advocacy community. And I think what we realized is that this was a mechanism where we could provide flexibility to the development community, which was sort of a must-have. And it can be very controversial regulating development, and that was a must-have. But at the same time, do it in a way that provides as good or better outcomes for our
Right.
water bodies than we would get with a more
So that's the
traditional approach.
environmental
So that's the
community.
environmental
That's right.
advocacy, and that's
That's right.
EPA, and having something that's kind of a win-win for everybody. And so I think in a real way, stormwater retention credit trading made it possible for us to put in place the stormwater management regulations that we have in the city.
That's great. You said the word flexible several times, and I think when you think about it, it provided flexibility to lots of different parts of the system and in lots of different ways. So actually, combining CSO and MS4 activity is very unusual. I mean, that's very innovative in and of itself to allow the trading, and that was something that everybody was looking at when you first came out with the rules.
Right.
To allow that cross regulatory
Yeah.
area engagement, that's innovative, and I think that's important for other people to see. Certainly the market and the businesses, flexibility had to be a major part of why they came around. And then I think it also required the environmentalists to be flexible and how they look at environmental restoration and
And
protection.
EPA.
And EPA.
Because remember,
that's
this
right.
was in a significant way being driven through our MS4 permit from EPA Region 3. While we were working on this, we were in the midst of a cycle of getting the revised MS4 permit in place. And so we were working really, really hard with the environmental community and the development community, trying to sort of figure out the right solution to this, and at the same time presenting that information to EPA, getting their input. And so I think we got to a place during that negotiation where they were comfortable wording the MS4 permit in a way that allowed for the approach that we wanted to take. And if we hadn't been sort of proactive about getting in front of that and trying to figure out the right solution, we could have ended up with something written into our permit that really tied our hands and maybe wasn't the best solution for our water bodies or for our stakeholders. We also established the guidance for how you build green infrastructure in the city, so we control that. Our one agency does the permitting, the enforcement, all those pieces of it. So it gives us the opportunity to sort of look at the whole picture and make sure that it's fitting together in the way that we intended for it, so that if it's not, to adaptively manage, because we're sort of seeing that whole picture. And it's something that's very different from, for example, like a large scale watershed trading program like a Chesapeake Bay trading program, where you have multiple different agencies, multiple different states involved, different types of green infrastructure. It's agricultural practices versus wastewater treatment plants versus, green roofs. Like, there are all these different things that make it much harder to manage, let alone the enforcement varies across all of those jurisdictions. So we have that benefit of having it all integrated together.
That's true.
So our big impacts in terms of scaling up green infrastructure retrofits in the city, credit trading enabled, first of all, the stormwater management regulations we put in place. We talked about that. The other big thing, though, is now we're working on using the credit trading market ourselves as a city to invest in green infrastructure and to really scale up the pace of green infrastructure retrofits and the part of the city that needs it most, the MS4 part of the city. And this is really where the P3 piece of it comes in to it for us. We have a public problem, which is stormwater runoff impairing our water bodies. We want to enlist the private marketplace in helping us to solve that problem, and we're going to guarantee some level of return on their investment by buying credits from those projects as they go forward into the future. And that's exactly what we're doing. One of the great things about that approach for us is that it's all couched within the regulatory framework, so we can invest, the government can invest in green infrastructure by telling credit aggregating firms that we'll buy your credits from you for the next 6 years or 12 years at this price. But if the credit aggregator builds their green infrastructure and at the end of their project realize that they can get a better price by selling it to a regulated development project within our regulatory framework, they have that option.
And it's not hurting you.
It doesn't hurt us.
Your money's
In
still
fact, we're
sitting there.
saving our money,
That's
so
right.
we can do something else with our
That's
money.
right.
So That's one of the efficiencies for us. It also allows us to scale up our investment in green infrastructure. And then over the years, as more and more of the city triggers our regulations and more of there's more demand for credits in the marketplace, the city will be able to scale back its investment in green infrastructure as regulated demand absorbs more and more of that burden of keeping that green infrastructure installed and maintained.
One final question. How do you see your program being modeled in other communities? And if you don't think it can, why?
I think what we've done in Washington, D.C. makes a lot of sense for a city like Washington, D.C. Development is almost always, retrofitting our built environment with green infrastructure.
Equal.
It's an improvement over our status
Right.
quo. It's
Right.
rare. It's rare to have greenfields development in the city, and so in that context, it's you can have conversations about shifting, investment in green infrastructure from one watershed to another or one sewer shed to another. In a different way than you can in a greenfields area where if you plow under a meadow and you're going to do less than the maximum level of control there's going to be real impacts for the water bodies.
Not to mention all the other impacts, that environmental impacts are happening nonetheless.
Yeah, it's not one size fits all, but where it has the closest fit, I think, is with other cities. The scale of development varies from city to city, but I would imagine that the scale of development in most cities in the country is still dramatically greater than the scale of investment that the municipality is able to make. Local governments have small budgets, right? So there's a scale question, and for us, one of the things that we realized early on was that the amount of area of green infrastructure retrofits that we could get installed, so the amount of impervious area, built environment that could be retrofitted to have green infrastructure installed through our development, if we had regulations in place, was 10 times the area that we could retrofit with all of our other voluntary cost share subsidy programs combined. And we have, even if the scale of development isn't the same in other cities, I wouldn't be surprised if it's still the case that development is capable of achieving on a much bigger scale than the local budgets are able to achieve.
Brian, thank you very much. This has been great. It's always a pleasure talking this stuff with you. You know more about the markets than anybody I've ever met, so very nice of you to spend your time with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's quite a compliment. You must not have met very many people.
I haven't been out of this room in 3 months.